Hello, I'm Robert Emmett Hernan. I'm head of Bluestack Productions, the publisher of Irish Environment, an online magazine covering environmental matters on the island of Ireland. And I'm happy to be today here in Belfast at the headquarters of the Northern Ireland Environmental Link with Anne-Marie McDevitt. Hello, Anne-Marie. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Now, Anne-Marie, you're with the Royal Society for Protection of Birds?
Yes.
And what's your position there?
So I'm head of conservation at RSPB.
Uh-huh.
My team really deal with, I guess, a lot of policy and a lot of direct delivery for species and habitats as well.
Okay, but now today I actually want to talk to you about another role that you have, which is head of a team called Nature Matters Northern Ireland. Could you tell the audience what that is?
Yeah, so obviously Brexit has been a massive issue for us, so we decided as an ENGO sector in Northern Ireland to come together in coalition. We thought really it would be better for us to pool our resources, we'd be more effective, and it would mean the government could come to one single body. So we came together in coalition, and it's really a coalition of some of the bigger ENGOs, RSPB, National Trust, Northern Ireland Environment Link and Ulster Wildlife, and it's us working together to make sure that Brexit, I guess, as we leave the EU, that environmental protections are as strong, if not stronger, than when we were in the EU.
Now, when did you start Nature Matters Northern Ireland?
So we were working together in quite a loose coalition, but we came together more formally in May of last year.
Okay, and as I understand, there's about 4 focuses within the Nature Matters, and those are which?
So our focuses, two of the first focuses are really around the Common Agriculture Policy and the Common Fisheries Policy as we come out of the EU, and because those are things that are devolved, we'll have a chance to build our own policies in terms of fisheries, in terms of agriculture. So those are the first 2 streams of our work. The third really is around all the legislation and governance and enforcement that comes from the EU, and that's our nature and protection side of the house. And then the fourth one, which I guess is unique to us because we're the only part of the UK that has a land border with the EU, is our cross-border group, because for us the environment sees no border, and we want to see the island of Ireland seen as a single biogeographic unit and close cooperation on the environment north and south, so we have a stream in terms of cross-border. I mean, a sort of a fifth element really too is EU funding, which has been a huge source of funding enabling us to do a lot of environmental work.
Now, and today you're the head of the Nature Matters Northern Ireland, correct?
I'm the project manager, yes.
Okay, so I thought what we would do today, and later today I'm going to be interviewing some other members of the team on specific issues, that it would be useful for spend our time together on the larger issues about Brexit and the impact of Brexit on Northern Ireland protection of natural resources. And that becomes an almost impossible question to ask you, because we're sitting here today, this is in late October of the 2018, and we have no idea what's going to happen with Brexit. So for purposes of our conversation, I thought we could make certain assumptions and then play off those. And I think that what we can say is that Brexit in whatever form is going to affect the environment in Northern Ireland. And what that form is too early. So for purposes of our conversation, let's just pretend that the UK is going to not fully participate in the EU. It may have some foot in the EU, it may have no foot in the EU, but it won't be fully participating in the EU unless that gets reversed by another vote in Parliament. Some things will change no matter what form of Brexit, like CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, Common Fisheries Policies. But now let's look at the bigger issues. Something like the polluter pays and the precautionary principle, very important in environmental protections in the EU. Are those going to be changed if there's a Brexit form?
Yeah, I mean, under the EU Withdrawal Act, which was passed this year, the plan is that all the EU legislation, currently EU legislation and law, will pass over into UK law, and that's to prevent us kind of falling off a cliff edge when we leave the EU, and the principles will be moved over as well. That's just moving it across in a way for tidiness sake, but there are powers now then to kind of weaken that legislation and to change it, and we're even concerned about the transfer process itself. Here in Northern Ireland we're asking to be consulted on it, and we're in a difficult position because we have no government, because simply it's not always just a case of removing the word EU and changing it to something else, because it has knock-on implications for other pieces of legislation as well.
Okay, and I'll just, for the audience's sake, note that there is no devolved administration, no government in Northern Ireland since January of 2017 because of split in the parties. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. What other international compacts are there out there that offer protection for natural resources besides the EU?
So we were talking before, I think, about the kind of the Paris Accord and climate change there. So we're in underneath the UK Climate Change Act, and obviously that reports on our climate change targets.
Even when there was a government in Northern Ireland before January 2017, environmental policies had been devolved.
Yes.
And yet, at least the reputation seemed to be that Northern Ireland was probably less proactive or progressive on environmental issues than Scotland and Wales. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I think it would be, and I think the more progressive people here would have looked across to Scotland and Wales and thought we'd like to have some of that really. Whether it's a kind of a product of the history here in terms of the Troubles taking precedence really, because I guess it's not just about the environment, but in many other ways we're kind of behind in terms of policy thinking. But and then what happens is you also have it that the power sits with two big parties. We often find that the smaller parties are more environmentally aware and progressive, but they have less of a voice. And because we had the petition of concern in Northern Ireland, it meant that the parties could just veto something that was going through.
Petition of concern is a particular procedural matter with the balance of powers that they can interfere, they can stop some legislation just because it doesn't have full support of both communities and nationalists.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Now, besides the Paris Accord, the Good Friday Agreement in 1998, which created the peace and apparent peace in Northern Ireland at the moment, what effect does that have or impact on environmental issues?
Yeah, I think there's an awful lot of potential probably in the Good Friday Agreement. As it stands, it's kind of quite open to interpretation. Environment is a key part of it, and it obviously it's about the relationship between the UK and the Republic of Ireland. But in terms of our cross-border group at the minute, what we're going to do a piece of work to look at the Good Friday Agreement and what it has delivered so far and its potential. Whether we can get more in this draft withdrawal agreement, which still isn't finalised on the environment, because there's very little in that at the present time, using the Good Friday Agreement, and also looking forward and thinking, can the Good Friday Agreement do more for us post-Brexit as well? So we don't have all the answers on that one yet, but that's a key piece of work that our cross-border group are looking to do.
So it's an opportunity to incorporate some of that even without the EU laws, the Good Friday Agreement. And it does specifically mention that the North-South ministerial bodies are supposed to deal with environmental. Yeah,
and there are bodies such as the Lochs Agency and Waterways Ireland. There's less so any bodies to do with kind of species and habitats, that side of the environment. So I think there's an awful lot more potential with the Good Friday Agreement.
Okay. Now, what has been the impact? We've talked about this lack of a devolved administration, which disappeared in January 2017. For so many reasons we can't even go into them today.
Yeah.
But what's been the practical impact in terms of this Brexit move on that?
So really what it's meant for us is that we can do a certain amount of work with civil servants but only go so far. So the department most affected by Brexit here is the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, DERA. And they set up fairly quickly. The first group that they set up was the Trade and Agriculture Committee, and clearly because they had concerns about the relative importance of agriculture here and of trade and our connection with the Republic of Ireland. So that was one of the first kind of stakeholder groups they set up to look at how we would move forward, post-Brexit. And then they subsequently set up groups on environment, marine and fisheries and rural affairs. But really the trade and agriculture is the one that has moved most fully forward. But even there, and we've been sitting on that group and together with the stakeholders from the agri-food and from the agriculture industry and farming representatives, we've been able to kind of put together a high-level document about what we want to see from a future policy. And that's been put out, but it can't even be put out to consultation because there is no minister. It's called a stakeholder engagement exercise. And that's brilliant, but that's now, as far as we know, I think as far as they can go within their remit. And it also means that the transition period is a fairly short period, as you know, from end of March next year to end of December 2020. That's the time where you'd have to get everything ready. And so discussions happening now are important to try and get a head start on that. So we're in a position where we can only do so much because of the lack of government.
Now, you also mentioned, when we were talking beforehand about the interactions with business communities, and tell us about that, how in terms of this process of trying to deal with Brexit, that's kind of been a new coalition formed,
yeah.
which is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, we were saying about are there any positives that have come out of this? I guess coming together as an NGO sector ourselves, but we've also been looking around and thinking who else kind of aligns with this, and I guess some of them are more surprising than others. So in terms of business community, when we started to talk, because there has been very little talk about environmental governance in Northern Ireland, and as you know, we have no independent environmental protection agency here, so we're kind of a step back even from the rest of the UK. But when we started to talk to them about what would it look like in the future, I mean, they were very supportive, because business likes certainty. It wants to show it has corporate social responsibility. It's very much used to adhering to environmental law, which again gives it certainty. So we found that there are some, a business in the community and other business groups are very much willing to support us. We're also have been talking to the Human Rights Consortium here in Northern Ireland as well, and we're actually going to be doing an event with them again, because when we showed them our key asks, they'd say yes, clean water, clean air, clean bathing waters, access to looking at biodiversity or wildlife. These are all human rights.
Okay.
So I guess Brexit has forced us to think differently, and to come together, which is I think it's very, one of the positives here in Northern Ireland is that's very easy to do because we're small.
And everybody knows everybody.
And everybody knows everybody.
Now, what about the farmers? I mean, have you been able to engage in any way differently? I mean, traditionally there's been conflict between the environmental communities and the farmers. Has that changed at all with Brexit?
Yeah, I think it has. I mean, that stakeholder group I said to you, the DERA stakeholder group, so the farming unions were on that, but we've also held kind of meetings with them separately to think about where we have common ground. So we're not totally aligned in terms of our ask really is around a public money for public goods model, which has been brought forward in England. And the idea behind that is that we pay farmers really we reward them for all the good things that they're doing in terms of when they manage peatlands for storing carbon and storing water, they manage for biodiversity, they give us clean soils and clean air, and at the same time they're dependent on the healthy environment. So we're asking really that at the present time, as you know, they're paid really they used to pay per head of stock, and then they were paid per area of land they own, and now we're asking really that they're paid for these public goods, and we think it's the best way to safeguard farming. So the farming unions aren't totally aligned with us on that, and I think it's partly because it's such a big change from the way things are now, but we think this is the best way to safeguard it when farming may be up against health and education, which take up huge amounts of the budget and are only likely to get bigger over time or need more money over time. So but we are aligned on things like as well as the public money for public goods, we would say that farmers definitely need to have a fair price for their produce, which is really not happening as a result, I guess, of the control of the supermarkets and things. So we're in the process of producing a document which kind of looks at the areas of common ground that we have, but we hope to move closer together on the other areas as well.
Now, do you find a distinction between working with the kind of intensive agricultural component of the sector, the big farms, versus the kind of hilltop farmers? Is there a distinction there in terms of your working relationships?
There is a big difference, and one of the groups I wanted to chat about too is that a kind of group has been set up too called the Nature Friendly Farmers Network, and it sees itself, I guess, as a bit of an alternative in that it does support the public money for public goods, and certainly, as you say, if you're in hill land, that public money for public goods model is a win-win for you, really. I guess the concerns are for an intensive farmer in the lowlands, how does public money for public goods work there? So I guess it's and that is something that we'd have to work out, because at the end of the day, really, in this, what you don't want to have is loss of farmers from the land, because people tend to think that environmentalists want the gate to be closed. Well, if we close the gate, everything would just turn into trees eventually. And the majority of our wildlife is dependent on cereals being grown and rushes being cut and ground being grazed. So we need active farmers, and I think that's one of the biggest messages is, firstly, we can't lose farmers.
Right.
So we have to be careful in how we go about a new policy that we bring, that we keep farmers farming too.
Now, let me come back to something, Anne-Marie, that you mentioned earlier, and that was the watchdog, and because it raises all the issue about what the enforcement powers are that exist now with full participation by the UK and necessarily Northern Ireland in the EU. What are those powers that exist now in judicial review within the EU that we may lose?
So I think there's still talk about whether we're going to lose access to the European Court of Justice, and for us that's been a really powerful thing where, if we didn't have that, I think we wouldn't have adherence to environmental law the way we do, because of the threat. Even sometimes the threat of taking something to the European Court of Justice is sufficient, and obviously they impose large fines. So we would, depending on what happens, the idea is that we would lose access to European Court of Justice. So we will need a very powerful watchdog in the UK. It's difficult to see in Northern Ireland how we would replicate that, given that at the present time we don't even have an independent Environmental Protection Agency as we stand, and then there's the cost of it.
The UK and Scotland and Wales have now independent environmental agencies, right?
Yeah.
Are they just are they suggesting they beef up those agencies with more powers and for oversight, monitoring?
I think there will have to be a change in their existing setup. I think the issue is that even with those EPAs, we still needed the strength of the European Court of Justice.
And in fact, in the Republic of Ireland, of course, it has the independent EPA, and yet it's brought in front of the Court of Justice all the time. Maybe more than most countries in the world.
That's right.
Emery, I suppose to perhaps finish, are you optimistic that something positive will come out of this Brexit for the environment in Northern Ireland?
I guess if I'm not hugely, really. The only thing I probably have some hope of is the common agriculture policy, creating our new agriculture policy. And the reason for that is that the common agriculture policy itself would have been very hard to change. We tried to lobby on that for a long time. So I think we have more of a chance of making a difference there. And because it's such a big driver environmentally here, and the good that it can do, I think that's one kind of shining light. I think the difficulty is that we probably are doing things differently and in ways which are helping us move forward, but the problem is the outside world is just moving a bit faster.
Yes.
So we are now coming together in coalition. We are now looking at unusual partnerships. We now have more of a voice, but it always feels as if it's just still a bit too slow for what's happening. So I think we will probably get there eventually. But I think the Brexit is it's a huge risk to us environmentally.
And hopefully perhaps you'll get the independent environmental agency that you've been struggling for a number of years here.
Well, I think that is one thing that has got potential out of this. I think now there's probably recognition that if anything we would need to have that, because even in terms of the negotiations between the EU and the UK, the EU is asking the UK to have high levels of environmental protection. Well, it has to have that across every UK country. So I think in a way, that is one element which will help us in terms of negotiating, is they will be looking across and saying, okay, are you putting in place the levels of protection that you're saying that you are, and are you doing them across every part of the UK? Is there consistency? So I guess there's sort of some hope there that we could have that.
It's always good to end an interview with a note of hope.
Yes.
So thanks Anne-Marie for talking to us today.
No worries.